welcome. Thank you for taking the time to join us today as we discuss the important topic of organizational culture. My name is Tom Garrity. I'm a management consultant at WP&C, where part of my work centers on leading transformation and operational excellence. We've designed this webinar to share our perspective on specific actions leaders can take, or need to take rather, to turn their culture into a true competitive advantage that drives performance and industry-leading results. By the end of the hour, we hope you'll walk away with an understanding of what culture is and why it's so important, the essential traits that all high-performing cultures share, and a proven path that leads to sustainable improvements in your organization's culture. We've planned about 35 minutes for a presentation and 15 minutes for Q&A. If you have questions during the webinar, please type them into the chat and we'll do our best to get to them as we jump into the Q&A session. We'll follow up with answers to any questions we're not able to address by the end of the hour. The session will be recorded today, and we will send links of the recording, as well as links to the slides to participants within the next few days. So now, let me introduce Ernie Spence, one of our partners at WP&C, who will lead us through today's webinar. Ernie began his 22-year career in the U.S. Navy as an aircraft carrier-based fighter pilot, and then as a test pilot. He went on to command and lead the successful culture transformations in multiple F-18 squadrons. Since joining WP&C, Ernie has used his experience as a leader in one of the most dynamic and high-risk environments in the world to help shape our firm's perspective on human and organizational performance. Throughout his career, Ernie has received numerous awards for leadership and implementing truly transformational organization-wide change. Ernie, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Tom, and thanks to everybody who's joined our webinar today. I'm really excited to talk to you about how we take and build a high-performing organizational culture that is really, in my opinion, your key to unlocking some sustainable industry-leading performance, no matter which industry you're in. As we get into this, I want to just take one moment here to introduce our firm and Wilson Perumal Company, what we do, and we are really focused, laser-focused, on helping business leaders compete and win in a complex world. As a premier global consultancy, we are supporting multinationals, private equity firms and their operating companies, as well as government clients. Our firm was founded on this unique perspective that we have around complexity. We help clients tackle the complexity that is in their business that is adding cost, degrading performance, and undermining execution. We know that there's very good complexity that is part of how we create value for our clients and our customers, but it's this undesirable complexity that we're very much focused on. In order to do that, we focus on both strategy and operations, and what we see is that it's that confluence where the strategy and operations comes together is where most companies seem to struggle the most with the impacts of complexity on their operations. We're thought leaders in this space. The firm has published 2 best-selling business books on the topic. We've done innovative and groundbreaking research that has appeared in publications like the Wall Street Journal and the MIT Sloan Management Review. And we know that leaders around the world are using our thoughts around this topic, complexity, to make their businesses grow and execute better. As we think about how complexity affects our culture, that's really where we're going to get to today. So ultimately, your company's culture affects everything, and it can be your most powerful competitive advantage. We also believe that when you have a high-performing organizational culture, it is part of your competitive advantage that is exceptionally hard for others to replicate and duplicate. We see that companies, and research shows that companies that have a strong culture have significantly higher employee engagement in their businesses than their competitors do. We also see that when businesses have more employee engagement, they tend to be significantly more profitable. They have lower turnover. And when we talk to our employees that are working in these companies, over 3/4 of them tell us that the company culture significantly influences how they go about doing their jobs every day. We've done research that has shown that, in the industrial environment, that companies that are focused on creating a high-performing culture, they're twice as effective at preventing injuries in the workplace. they pay significantly, orders of magnitude less in fines and penalties when it comes to compliance-related issues. And perhaps most significantly, they spend about 8% less on average on SG&A costs as a percentage of their revenue. And when you think about companies that are spending, that have, hundreds of millions or billions of dollars in annual revenue, spending 8% less on your SG&A costs is a tremendous amount of value that can be created. Recent research has shown that companies with a strong organizational culture oftentimes have about 20 to 30% higher market value than their competitors. This is not a surprise to anybody on this call, I would suspect, because over 90% of all business executives agree that their company culture is very important. But unfortunately, only about 16% of executives will say that the culture in their business is where they want it to be. And over half of senior leaders say that the governance and management systems that are essential to operating and managing their businesses on a day-to-day basis are actually working against them creating the culture that they want. And probably perhaps most scary is that over 3/4 of the employees that have been surveyed have said that they are facing culture-related tensions at work that they're not sure how to resolve. And these show up in terms of things like, hey, production targets versus safety and quality goals, or perhaps sales goals or financial decisions that they have to make that appear to be in conflict with what they understand is the fundamental values that they hold dear, or what the company is telling them is important. So we know, and we've heard from many, many executives, that tackling culture is a very daunting task for many leaders. Many will tell us that it's an issue that's just too hard for many reasons. It takes too long to change culture. In a big organization, they believe that you can't really manage culture. It's just something that happens. We all have too many things that we feel that are going on, and adding one more topic is going to be distracting. And we've also seen, and probably over the course of our careers, perhaps we've personally experienced, we've been in organizations that have tried to drive to a more healthy, high-performing culture, and they failed. But even for those who do go down this path to do it, they find that it's oftentimes very difficult to measure progress. We all have many, many surveys that are in the marketplace. We've probably received the results of these surveys as leaders, and we find that there's lots of information in there, but none of it is actionable. It doesn't help us understand what we should do. When we think about setting tangible goals about what our culture should be, it seems to be impossible when we're talking about something that's so squishy, and it's difficult to get people to agree about what it is we're actually talking about. And even if we do go down this path and we start to see change, it's difficult for many leaders to understand, well, what it is that I'm doing, or what the leaders in the business are doing that's actually working and what isn't. Which makes it, in the end, it's very easy for when you think about tackling culture, there's so many ways that it can go wrong. People are going to resist the change. You may surface other issues that have to be dealt with that could either be a distraction or stand in the way of other priorities that may be coming up. It's oftentimes seen as an excuse to not go and do the other things that the business already knows is important. So how do we make it work and fit into the business and not just become something else to do? And lastly, and I know this is a real consideration for a lot of folks, if I go down this path and it doesn't work out, how is that going to reflect on me? Who's going to take the blame for the resources, energy, and effort that gets put into it? But my personal experience and our firm's experience has shown that real, quantifiable, sustainable improvements, and these are improvements that matter to the business in a material sense, as well as the people that are working at it, can be made quickly if we take the right approach. So let's just define what it is that we're talking about. Culture is what sets your organization apart. And we're all part of many, many different cultures. We have a culture in the organization or the business that you run. We have our family culture. We have culture associated with civic groups and organizations that we're a part of. We have culture at a national level. So defining what culture is really important. And so I want to use this culture onion model as the anchor point here. So our culture is made up of many things. At its core are the things that we value. And it also includes things like our practices, there's heroes and symbols and rituals. This has all been well documented in the academic literature. But one of the leading thinkers about organizational performance and specifically how it ties to culture has really narrowed it down. And Andrew Hopkins has pointed out that when we think about culture, it's best understood as the individual practices. You can see it most clearly when you look at how organizations do things. And because values are at the center of this, of what's the core to our culture, we have to realize as leaders that it's exceedingly hard to change them because we have to peel through all of those other layers to get to the values, and then layer on the fact that in the end, as humans, we just decide what our values are going to be very early on in life. And really about the age of 6 or 7, we stop believing things just because people tell us to believe it should be believed. We start becoming independent thinkers. And so once we've once we've subscribed to the set of values that we think are important to us, it becomes very hard to change them. Yet that's how many leaders go about changing culture, right? We say, hey, here's a new set of values. We print some posters, we put them on the wall, and we say this is important and this is should influence how we go about doing work. But we don't really tell people how to do it. The key to unlocking a successful culture change is you've got to realize that yes, the values are central, but you can change them from the outside in by looking at and being very specific about how we're going to drive the organizational practices that will make those values come to life. And one of the most important points that I want to make to you all today is, and I hope you take away from this, is that culture is easiest to see and understand when we look at how work gets done in the organization and how decisions are made. If we put it in that framing as leaders, it becomes much more clear what we should do about culture. So if that's the point of view we're going to take, is that culture shows up in terms of how we do things and how we make decisions, then it becomes very easy to see that an unhealthy culture can lead to absolutely devastating outcomes. And all the examples I put on the slide here, going back several years to current ongoing crises in large global organizations, all resulted in significant economic and financial impacts, both to the companies, but to the communities and the countries in which they work. And they also had very significant impact on the lives of the people who were part of those companies, including, all the way up into serious injury and death. And when we think about, these particular incidents, you can take examples like the 2003 Space Shuttle incident, where that was very much tied to leadership and cultural dynamics that existed between different parts of that organization. I think the 2007 failed merger of Daimler and Chrysler was a case study in not paying attention to how the culture, what the culture was in those organizations, and the tremendous loss of value that occurred out of that because they did not sufficiently address those issues. We think about reputational risk. What happened at Volkswagen and Wells Fargo, where you take management and leadership influences on the organizational culture that put employees into that position where they were facing those ethical dilemmas, and they felt like they had no choice but to make the awful decisions that they made. And then obviously what's going on at Boeing, is leading to, an enduring crisis in that organization as they try to figure out how they should be working and how they should be making decisions. The other thing that becomes apparent when we look at it in this sort of framing is that the improbable incidents that each one of these represents is becoming more and more common and more costly, which means for us as leaders, the consequences of not taking action on this can be probably and should be more daunting than the challenges that we talked about a moment ago about, well, if we do take action, Here are the things that we have to deal with. And there are so many folks in the world that would say that those sort of incidents that we saw on the prior slide are actually just the cost of doing business. And one of the a sociologist that's done a lot of thinking and writing on this, Charles Perrow, in the early 1980s, he came out with a book called Normal Accidents. And we look at this and say it's a very pessimistic view, because Charles said in this book that regardless of the effectiveness of our management and operations, accidents and systems that are characterized by tight coupling and interactive complexity are going to be normal or inevitable, and they cannot be foreseen or prevented. And that, to me, as a leader, feels very, very scary, because that means that it really doesn't matter if you subscribe to this view what it is that you do as a leader. Your organization is going to suffer at some point a catastrophic failure. But we don't think that's inevitable. What we do believe, and we know is inevitable, is that people are going to make mistakes. Yet, when you have a healthy, high-performing organizational culture, that ends up being a point of resilience that enables you to catch those mistakes that people will inevitably make and correct them before they come into that before they become a catastrophic failure. And that's one of the things that sets these high-performing organizations apart. So, as we think about what is a high-performing organization, what we have seen here at Wilson Perumal is that all high-performing organizations share a common set of cultural traits, and they are all very deliberate about managing on their culture, regardless of the size of that organization. And those characteristics that are common across all of these organizations in different industries that outperform their peers and consistently achieve incredible levels of operational performance, they focus on what distills down to these 5, what we call pillars. And we'll talk a little bit about this. So there's in all of these organizations, you see a tremendous level of knowledge. People not only know what they're supposed to do, they know how to do it, they know when they're supposed to do it, and they know why they're supposed to do it. These organizations operate with a lot of formality. They do their work in a very specific way for a very specific purpose, and they understand what that is, and people that are doing the work understand what those purposes are. They have a questioning attitude that's very, very strong. They ask themselves, when I take this action, what outcome do I expect to see? And then they go and they check to see if that actually happened. There's a lot of what we call very forceful team backup. And this team backup is in place because we acknowledge and understand the fact that people are going to make mistakes. And we're backing each other up because of the likelihood that we did make a mistake. There's not an expectation or a threatening tone that comes with this backup that says, ha ha, I got you. I can now blame you for a mistake. They celebrate finding these mistakes because it demonstrates that their culture is working the way it ought to be. And lastly, there's integrity. And integrity in this case means that that you can count on me to do what it is that I say I'm going to do, and I can count on you and everybody else in the organization to do what it is that you say that you're going to do. And this becomes a very powerful system of beliefs and values and operational anchor points for the organization. And you can look at high performing organizations, and they may call them different things. They may describe them slightly differently, but when you distill them down, you see that these are present in all of these organizations. An example of a very high performing organization is the U.S. Nuclear Navy. And I know we have some attendees on the call today that have spent time in this organization. And what's probably most interesting about the nuclear Navy aspect is it's foundational to this thinking around high-performing organizational culture. And you know, this year is the 70th anniversary of the nuclear Navy. They've been successfully operating mobile nuclear reactors in austere, remote environments, some of the most challenging operational environments you can imagine, where they have operators that have an average age of only 22 years. They change out the entire crew every 3 years. Yet, for 70 years, the U.S. Navy has been operating these mobile nuclear reactors and never had a major nuclear incident. And the reason that that has happened is because they deviated from what most folks think is the common military culture of command and control. I do, you, I say, you do. We follow orders. There's high degrees of, lots and lots of discipline and punishment for making mistakes. The nuclear Navy took a very, very different approach where they adopted these principles. And they said, what we have to have in place is a system and an environment where people know what to do, they know how to do it, and they know why. And they became very, very successful at that. And it became an example. And so although the foundations for what we're talking about came out of the nuclear Navy, and it's been adopted into other elite military organizations like Special Forces or Naval Aviation, carrier-based naval aviation, where I spent many years flying and operating, it has proven relevant and successful in many, many other industries. Things that are high likelihood, high consequences of failure. You saw it get adopted into commercial aviation, which drove a tremendous reduction in accident and incident rates across global commercial aviation. It got adopted into the medical field, where it has had a huge impact on operating procedures and basic hospital procedures. It's also prevalent in many industrial type operations, and financial services operations are starting to adopt this. And we think probably the next place this becomes a very significant impact on how we operate our businesses, and we think about cybersecurity and IT operations. But just defining those 5 values is not enough. You can't just put a poster on the wall and expect that it's going to make a difference in your business. What you have to do is you have to take those operational values, and you have to define them in the context of your organization. You have to tie it to real work practices. And that means that we take things like level of knowledge, and we have to describe to the organization what it means. It means that you understand what you do and why. It means that we're continually seeking greater knowledge, and not just knowledge about my immediate work area. When you look at a high-performing organizational culture, people in that not only know about their job, but they know about the jobs of the people that they associate with, or they collaborate with, or that are affected by their work. And they're working to expand their level of knowledge almost on a daily basis. How that gets applied in a high-performing organization is that they would treat things like cross-training and rotational assignments as part of standard development plans, and they're not just reserved for high performers. And you could see that for formality too, where everybody in the organization has a very high degree of seriousness about what they do and how they do it. Procedures are followed explicitly, but they also recognize that when a procedure needs to change, there's a formal process for updating SOPs and policies and that sort of stuff. And they have clearly defined ways to escalate issues. And they have clearly defined expectations about that. And as a leader or a supervisor, when an issue gets escalated to me, then I have now responsibilities, and that ties to the formality. And you could go on and you could make further examples. We could offer further examples for how each of these pillars are defined at a high level. And then we would want to go and start to adapt that down to the more tactical working level for the people, so they could understand how to apply this. Just simply telling people what they are is not enough. And it's a key part to how we think about going about really changing the culture in an organization. And so to do that, to change the culture, we really do need a deliberate and focused approach. Here at WP&C, we developed an approach that we call LEADS, which stands for Learn, Establish, Align, Develop, and Sustain. And that's proven to be a highly effective methodology to deliver real, and this is probably the most important part, sustainable change in an organization. So the learn phase is you need to understand what your current culture is, why it is that way, how much people want it to change, and what those barriers to change are. The establish phase is that once you understand what the culture is, then you define the desired culture, and it needs to include those essential elements we talked about. You build a roadmap for change, and you get leader buy-in. Alignment is about rolling it out to the organization. We translate those operational values, those definitions I gave you some examples of, into role and level-based expectations at every level of the business. And then you start implementing, and you start teaching people how to think in terms of those operational values. Go back to our definitions. It's about how we work and how we make decisions, what culture is. And so we have to change change people's level of understanding about that. And then lastly, we go to the develop and sustain phase, where we really transition to now doing this proactive culture management, and we tie our cultural expectations to both organizational and individual performance. And that gets back to the point where every high-performing organization is in the develop and sustain phase. And so we can see that there are specific activities that you would do in each one of these phases, and you may be surprised about the amount of time that we think that most organizations will spend doing this. So in the learn phase, depending upon the size of your organization, that might last 4 to 12 weeks. And we have a tool which I'll demonstrate to you here in a moment around, we call the yardstick culture assessment. It helps us understand what the culture is across different levels and locations and functions in the organization. It helps us map to those high-performing traits and understand the barriers for change and where we can get traction quickly. And there are similarly specific things that we would want to do as we go through a culture transformation to drive through each one of these phases. But as we get out to that develop and sustain phase, it might take us 6 or 8, 10 months to get to that point where we're now starting to transition to that proactive culture management. But that is the point in which it just becomes part of how we're managing the business. But the good news is that we start creating value very early on. As a senior leader in your organization, when you learn what the culture is, why it is that way, what the desire for change is, that enables you to start making actionable decisions to improve your culture right then. So you can start realizing value in a matter of just weeks if you go down this path. I do want to focus just a little bit on this learn phase and how we do that. We do this through a tool we call Yardstick. And Yardstick provides us the insights that you need to create a truly high-performing culture. It's a web-based tool. It takes about 20 minutes. It's multi-language. We've deployed it around the world in many different environments, many different types of companies, and it's all based upon the attributes of high-performing organizations that we talked about. It tells us what the current culture is and what people think it should become. And the way it does that is we take 40 cultural descriptors, some examples of which might be people can be trusted or viewing coworkers as friends, and we force rank them on a scale of most like us to least like us. And then we do that twice. We do it the first time to describe what the current culture is. The second time we ask people to describe what they want the culture to be in your business. And the results of that end up being very, very telling. So here's an example of a recent yardstick report or some data we got from a recent client. This is for a group of employees that are reporting to, in that organization, what they call a senior manager. So I'll orient you to the chart here. Over on the left-hand side, we have the 40 attributes. And on the bottom, you have the scale that ranges from least like us to most like us. The blue dots indicates the score for each one of these attributes. And so you can see in this organization, in the current culture for this group of employees, the most dominant attributes are being result-oriented, doing what you're told, being professional, and doing whatever it takes. The least dominant attributes are punishing the failure of mistakes, are punishing failure of mistakes or tolerating shortcuts. And what's really important is you see some of these are in this blue text. Those are the attributes that we associate with high-performing organizations. And you can see, although I've got them blurred out here, you can see about half of those high-performing attributes are ranked by this group in the bottom half of their current culture. So it's not like them at all. When we look at what they say the future culture can be or should be, we can now compare it to where it is with the current culture, and you see a shift. Now the most dominant attributes are following procedures and people can be trusted. And then those two at the bottom remained at the bottom. And you can also see how much change there is in the ranking. So Following procedures, it was near the top, and it's one of the ones that they want to see increase and get stronger, but they actually want to see people being trusted, getting much, much stronger, and some of these other attributes. And you can see that clustered here at the top, there's a big block of blue, right? So this group has a keen view of what some of those high performing attributes should be in their organization. But there's also some others that stay down around the middle, and there's some that we would consider to be non-high performing attributes that are ranked here still pretty high. Another very important piece of information we get from this data is what we call a delta. And that's a measure of the degree desire for change for this group. We've given the yardstick to probably tens of thousands of people. And what we found is that this delta value, when it's above about 30%, that indicates that group has a very strong desire for change. If it's below 20, they have a very low desire for change. So this group here with a delta at 29 is right on the cusp of having a high desire for change. And we can see exactly which attributes they think should be getting stronger and which ones should be getting weaker. And you can even come down and say, well, yeah, punish failure and tolerate shortcuts. Those are still at the bottom, but you can see that in this organization, they think that that is something that is happening, and they should be doing even less in the future. Now, we can take these results and we can compare them across groups, locations, levels, lots of different ways. And this starts to provide us some very insightful information. This, again, comes from some of our clients where we looked at the executive level, senior managers, and frontline leaders. And you notice that the executive team, the senior managers, they have very high deltas. They have a very strong desire for change, but the frontline leaders have a much lower desire for change. And that's interesting because the frontline leaders are going to be the ones who are helping their employees actually do things differently. And so there's already a disconnect we can see here. Why is it that these folks have such a desire for change and these have much less? We'll have to deal with that in our change management as we think about executing this. The other thing that's really interesting here is when we look at these top 4 attributes for these groups. I don't have the attributes on the slide here, but I can tell you that the things that the executive teams are the 4 most important attributes of the future culture are actually different than the top 4 for this group of senior managers. And understanding that before you embark on this journey is so important, because if you didn't know that, you could very well be working towards different ends, and Yardstick is going to reveal that to us. So we can use this tool to make comparisons between groups of, between roles, locations, functions. We've also done it to show between folks who came from an acquired business or based upon tenure. There's lots of different ways we can cut this data to become very, very insightful about how we should think about improving the culture in the organization. The last thing that I'll point out here is in terms of results that you get from Yardstick is we go back to those pillars, and we can see how strong those pillars are in terms of integrity, level of knowledge, questioning attitude, formality, and team backup. And in this group, we can see that the strongest pillar the pillar they were strongest in is in this notion of formality, but all of the others were fairly weak. Yet in the future, they have a fairly good view of what a culture should be, right? So they're making those 4 pillars get much taller while formality is improving a little bit. But I would advise this group of senior leaders leading this organization that they're not setting their targets high enough, because we can benchmark against known high-performing organizations, and you can see while we're moving in the right direction, we probably need to set those aims a little bit higher. And that's the really actionable, interesting things that Yardstick can tell us. It tells us specifically about what your culture needs to change and why. So as we come towards the end here and move into questions, I want to just leave you with a few thoughts in terms of how do you go about doing this. So as a senior leader, most important, you need to understand what your current culture is, why it is that way, how much the organization at every level wants to change, what the barriers are, and you have to be really clear about who's going to lead that transformation and what their roles as leaders is going to be. To get started, you've got to define that future state clearly and ensure it includes the right essential traits. You've got to set expectations and follow up on them. Leaders have to go first. So often I see that when we say, hey, we're going to change this organization, what the people who are working in it hear is that we're expecting them to change, and leaders are not going to be part of it. That just doesn't work. And we've got to take those future culture expectations and translate them down to the work that people do. And that includes leaders' work. Leaders, as a senior leader, you've got to stay involved. You've got to think about making early changes simple and very actionable and real so you can get some momentum. You've got to follow up and make sure that your leaders, supporting leaders, are not working against you, that they're actually engaged. And you really do need to tie it to business results and to real business actions and results, because then that will help make the case for why you're trying to do this. And this gets back to some of those profitability, turnover, effectiveness metrics that can be very powerful. And I would also just suggest that it is impossible to over communicate as you're going through this journey. What is changing, why, and where you are in the journey. Most leaders think they're talking about it too much, and the reality is they're not even close to talking about it enough. We've helped a lot of clients across many different industries turn their culture into a real sustainable competitive advantage. Some examples I'll give you here. This top one, the 70% reduction in operational safety incidents, that was with a client who had worked for several years, spent tens of millions of dollars with other firms trying to improve their safety performance, had little to no results. We helped them, and in less than 9 months, we reduced their safety incidents by over 70%. Another company we helped less than 12 months after we started the transformation initiative, they had realized a $200 million improvement in operating profit. We've seen incredibly high reductions in employee turnover, sick days. We've seen very meaningful increases in production asset availability in industrial environments. That results in significantly greater throughput and obviously profitability that comes from that. We've seen on the softer side of things quantifiable improvements in supervisor effectiveness, organizational communications, and accountability, lower levels of frustration with employees, with management. And we've also seen where business units that we've been working in as part of larger global corporations have specifically been recognized after using our tools and our methodologies, that they have been recognized for having the Global Best Culture Award in that business. So some couple of key takeaways. Just remember, hey, culture drives all aspects of your organization's performance, and all high-performing organizations are very deliberate about managing their culture. Every high-performing culture shares a common set of traits, those 5 traits that we talked about. We believe we've proven that getting and sustaining those results is much easier than many leaders think, but it does require a deliberate approach with the right set of tools to be able to give you the insights that you need to take action. And the first step in taking that action is to understand what your culture is today and why it is. And we think that yardstick tool is the best tool on the market to be able to do that. If you want to learn a little bit more about that, you can reach out to me. I've got my contact information coming up on a slide in a moment, or you can just visit wilsonparamount.com, where we have a lot of information about this on our website as well. Before we shift to questions, I just do want to point out that we don't oftentimes work in culture on the topic of culture in isolation. It's tied to the real business challenges that you are facing every day. And that's where you can be most effective, is when you tie your culture change initiatives to the specific things that you're trying to do in your business. So we're doing a lot of work around tying these concepts to cyber and IT operations to reduce the risk of cybersecurity breaches. We've been very successful in applying this to issues around pre- and post-merger integration and helping realize the value of those acquisitions and mergers. I did some speaking around to the American Manufacturing Summit recently on the topic of human and organizational performance. We talk a little bit more in depth about how we do that and the elements, so that may be something you want to look at. And I've also talked about prior transformations I've led as a senior leader as part of the TEDx speaking circuit. So with that, let me pause. Let me hand it back over to Tom to see the questions that may have come in while we've been talking.
Ernie, thank you. All very well said. I will shift it now to focus on some of the questions that have come in during the presentation. For those listening, if you haven't already, please feel free to take a moment and continue to share your questions through the chat. We'll try to get to them. So the first one is about where do you start? And so where do you usually start with trying to change a culture? Is it with a business unit, a region, a functional area, or someplace else?
Yeah, it could be all of those things. And I think it's really important that you tie it to some particular business outcome that you're driving to. And so it may be around a specific performance issue. Sometimes we, as I mentioned, the safety incident rate at that one client that we worked with. Others is around, production capacity and throughput. Others have been around issues such as employee engagement and turnover. We've used all of those as starting points to say, hey, well, we want to change the culture to achieve this outcome, and then we can specifically start seeing what how it's affecting it and the actions we're taking are. Another approach that we've also used very successfully is to start in a portion of the business, perhaps a functional area. Perhaps, sometimes it's the operations group or the quality group, or maybe an entire business area, a business unit. Maybe it's this group that's focused on this market or this set of products, and then we use that as a proof point to the larger organization that these characteristics can have a very meaningful impact. Regardless of the approach, we need to have a real. We need to create a compelling business case for why changing the culture will result in some benefit to the business, and then we can make it clear, and we start to target or tie back those definitions of what those pillars are, and it becomes a much more tangible and real kind of event or exercise in the organization for people at every level to understand why they would be doing something different. Where it's probably most difficult to do is to say, hey, we want to just have a better culture, and talk about it from kind of an academic or a conceptual point of view. It's very hard to get people to change their behaviors or the ways of thinking about how they're making decisions and taking actions if it's anchored in just some kind of ephemeral or squishy concept.
All right. And so the next question ties to the pillars you just mentioned again. How do companies apply or adapt the pillars to their specific business needs?
Yeah, so how we help companies do that is we start with an understanding of what really drives how they make and execute decisions and take actions. And so, the definition or the words we just described in this presentation, things like forceful team backup or integrity, level of knowledge, that may be applicable or it may not. And so we spend some time with the senior leaders understanding how they think about their business and what those words are that are meaningful to them. And then we put the real definitions behind them. And that's typically an exercise that happens with the senior leaders. And we get input from some lower level folks as well to make sure that we have the right perspective in there. But we really want to put those definitions in the context of the specific business. It doesn't work to just a generic set of words that could mean anything to anybody. It really needs specific. And so that's an exercise that we go through in the established phase, which is typically pretty short, right? It's just a couple to a few weeks to get those definitions right. And then we're ready to start thinking about, okay, how do these definitions apply to the different levels? Because quite frankly, the definition of what formality or integrity, team backup means to somebody in a senior manager role is very different than what somebody who is in a technician's role, or a safety operator, or even somebody in finance, somebody in training. They're going to be doing different things. We want them to be using those same principles, but how they apply to their job is different, and we have to be able to describe that to them in a very meaningful way.
Excellent. And so back to the people, I mean, who do you typically see as the key leaders or the doers that make a culture transformation possible? How do we identify those folks?
Yeah, so I think the kind of the simple answer is it's all the leaders. And this is another common mistake we see is there is seen as in the organization somebody who's responsible for transforming the culture. And then everybody else is going to continue to do the job that they have been assigned as a normal course of duties. The reality is that this needs to be a senior executive-led initiative. It needs to have the visibility, the endorsement of the senior business executives, and they have to be involved, right? They have to walk the talk. They have to show that they are fully internalizing these values, and it's affecting how they are making decisions and how they're doing their work. And then it also has to go all the way down to those frontline leaders. The frontline leaders are the ones who are going to help people, understand what team backup means, what level of knowledge means in their particular work that they're doing. And so we have to get the full leadership chain involved. And quite frankly, most leaders are not good change leaders. They may be very highly effective leading in a kind of a static, non-dynamic environment where they have a set of responsibilities and they're pretty clearly defined. But when we start talking about how do we do things differently to achieve better outcomes, many leaders are not well equipped for that. And you see that probably most apparent when we talk about just communicating change. I believe that change, communications is something that every leader has to be particularly involved with. Yet we see many, many organizations where they hand that off to a corporate communications group. And they say, hey, these are the folks who are going to, get the talking points. You're going to describe what it is how we're doing this. And then they just put that on blast and broadcast it out to the organization. And then you have folks on the shop floor at the working level asking their supervisor or their frontline manager, what does that mean? And if that leader can't answer that question, then that really is truly where the change is breaking down almost instantaneously based upon just the fact that folks don't know how to communicate it well.
All right. We've got time budget for one more question here, and so I'll ask it. Any tips on getting past internal resistance? It sounds like this person has had a false start on culture change in the past.
Yeah. So I think the key to understanding where the internal resistance comes from is it's very much tied to what we said you have to do in that learn phase. You need to understand what the current culture is, why it is that way, and what's the desire for change, and what are those barriers, which is something that we get very clear about with the yardstick and going through those that very first phase. Oftentimes we have the right ideas and we have it's the poor execution that will support it. And if that's the case, then I find that kind of restarting the initiative or taking a second bite at the apple is a little bit easier, because if folks believe it's the right thing to do is to change the culture to be more reflective of a high-performing organization, then it's around laying out the path and helping people understand what their role in it is and how the broader organization will go through this. If it's that we don't agree on where we're going to begin with, then it's a different problem set. And that's why the very first, step in this is to learn and understand why the culture is today and what you want it to be in the future. And we see that, we see even at a very small executive team level, a group of 6 or 8 executives who are working together day in and day out. We do the yardstick survey on a group like that. The participants are often shocked about the level, how differently they're thinking about what that future should be. And so that's really, in my mind, that's how you get past those false starts, is that you really kind of got to go back to square one and make sure that we're aligned on what we are and where we're going.
Okay, thank you, Ernie. And so that concludes our Q&A session. Thank you, everyone, for your attendance and your questions. Again, we're going to share the slides and a recording over the next few days. If you'd like to check out Yardstick, read more about how we've supported many successful transformations for our clients, or talk about how we might be able to help you, please reach out to Ernie or visit our website. Thanks all.